Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker. As is tradition on this Friday afternoon, I'm joined by Aaron Bastani. Aaron, how are you doing?
I'm very well, Michael. It's a little bit chilly outside. I'm nice and toasty inside wearing my jumper. It's autumn. It's Friday evening. Michael Walker's on YouTube. What more could anyone ask for?
Coming up tonight, I've got a really, really interesting interview with Liz Carr. She's an actress and disability rights activist, and we talked about the assisted dying bill, which was introduced to Parliament earlier this week and will be a huge subject of national debate, I think, over the weeks and months to come. Also, if you didn't know, Ash Sarkar was on Question Time last night. We'll go through some of the best bits. First, though, more fallout from the death of Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar. World leaders have been responding to the death of Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar. Joe Biden has said that Sinwar's death is a moment of justice, but also a moment of opportunity to achieve a ceasefire. I think you can take that as seriously as we should have taken everything that Joe Biden has said over the past 12 months. In any case, his US national security spokesperson, John Kirby, said this during a trip to Berlin.
Sinwar was the main obstacle to getting a ceasefire done. Every time his political advisors we'd negotiate with and through them to come up with a proposal, it would have to get to him. Of course, that took time because of the communications challenges, and then he would just refute it and refuse to move forward. And it's not as if, as I've said this before, it's not as if the Israelis weren't willing to continue to find compromises, and they did. Each and every time, Sinwar found a way to stop it. Now he's gone. So we'll see. I mean, Hamas obviously will make their own decisions about what their structure is going to look like and if and who might replace Mr. Sinwar. But yes, his death does provide a unique opportunity here to try to take advantage of where we are with Hamas, where Israel is with Hamas, and see if we can't get a ceasefire in place.
Now, what everyone has been reporting, I'm obviously not privy to these conversations about ceasefire negotiations, but what everyone has been reporting is that it is Netanyahu who has been the block to a ceasefire, right? We've had Daniel Levy on a number of times who says that, yes, it is. He's a former Israeli negotiator saying it is Netanyahu who has been blocking a ceasefire this entire time. In fact, it did seem like there were agreements from both sides, and then it goes back up to Netanyahu when he changes his conditions. Exactly the same thing happened with Lebanon. Briefings there were basically coming from people, around the White House saying they had an agreement that Netanyahu and Hezbollah had signed up to, and then Netanyahu decided that it was his priority to try and kill Hassan Nasrallah, and to successfully kill Hassan Nasrallah. So it's pretty clear that throughout this whole situation, it's been Netanyahu who has been the toughest block to any kind of ceasefire. So I think that was just the national security spokesperson for the United States lying to everyone. Last night, Netanyahu signaled himself that Sinwar's death would not mean an end to the war.
Well, this is not the end of the war in Gaza. It's the beginning of the end. To the people of Gaza, I have a simple message. This war can end tomorrow. It can end if Hamas lays down its arms and returns our hostages. The axis of terror that was built by Iran is collapsing before our eyes. Nasrallah is gone. His deputy Muhsin is gone. Haniyeh is gone. Def is gone. Sinwar is gone. The reign of terror that the Iranian regime has imposed on its own people and on the peoples of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, this too will come to an end.
Again, it's this war on terror, sort of terrifying narrative, which is that we are going to, I suppose, radically transform the face of the Middle East. Netanyahu, what he wants, of course, is a greater Israel. He's saying, anyone who stands in our way, basically, we can assassinate. And I mean, he's clearly going to be on a high, isn't he? People are saying, this is now the opportunity to get them to go for a ceasefire. I think every time, Netanyahu kills one more sort of leader who he sees as his enemy, he says, let's keep going. This is working. I mean, that seems to be his approach. Today, senior Hamas official Khalil al-Hayya released this video statement confirming Sinwar's death.
We honor the memory of the fallen martyr Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, the leader of Al-Aqsa Floods operation, who met his end standing brave with his head held high, holding his firearm, firing till the last breath, till the last moment of his life, following his demise, we reiterate that this noble blood, as is spilt, will continue to fuel our struggle and steadfastness. Hamas movement will continue to march, following in the footsteps of the founding fathers and the fallen martyr, until the aspirations of our people of entire liberation is achieved.
It's interesting. I've heard sort of lots of people saying, the struggle will continue after Sinwar's death. And I mean, that's obviously the case. Israel can't kill so many leaders that people still don't see the injustice they're living with and want to fight. I think the question is, do these assassinations make the resistance to Israel less effective, right? So there has been sort of a practice over the years where Israel sort of takes out people who it thinks could be charismatic leaders. And obviously, if you're taking out potential leaders or existing leaders, then that presumably will weaken the movement you're up against. It won't destroy it, because as long as there is injustice, as long as there are people without a state, they will resist it. But I suppose Netanyahu maybe doesn't really mind resistance. What he minds is effective resistance, and that's why taking out these leaders seems to be so high on his agenda. Meanwhile, more details have emerged about the circumstances of Sinwar's death. The New York Times has this account, which it says is based on briefings from 4 Israeli intelligence officials. So say this: the Israeli unit of trainee squad commanders was on patrol in southern Gaza on Wednesday when the Israeli soldiers came upon a small group of fighters, said the officials. And the soldiers, backed by drones, engaged in a firefight, and 3 Palestinian militants were killed. During the battle, Israeli fire brought down part of a building where the militants had taken cover. As the dust cleared and they began searching the building, the Israeli soldiers noticed that one of the bodies bore a shocking resemblance to the Hamas leader. 3 of those officials said that. The IDF has also published drone footage of what they say were Sinwar's final moments. It shows the view from a drone as it enters the first floor of a building that's clearly suffered extensive bomb damage. A man can be seen in an armchair, obviously very, very injured. And at the end of the video, he throws a stick. The circumstances of Sinwar's death didn't accord, really, with what US and Israeli intelligence had been briefing for over a year about the Hamas leader's whereabouts. Now, they had suggested he had been hiding deep underground using hostages as human shields. In reality, it appears he was killed fighting above ground. Aaron, I want to talk to you about sort of this footage which has been released by Israel. I'm seeing sort of wildly varying reactions and responses to it online. Israel, I think, released it because they wanted to show, this is a guy who was, clearly defeated, covered in dust. And I suppose they also just wanted to say to the world, haha, we got him. Lots of people on the other side saying, well, actually, you've shown this guy fighting till the end. This is exactly the kind of propaganda that Hamas might want if they want to create a martyr out of this man. I mean, where do you stand on that? I suppose it might just be you interpret it with your prior prejudices, and that's that. Or do you think there's anything more to it than that?
Well, I don't think it's a propaganda coup for Hamas that these images are being seen around the world. At the same time, I don't understand why Israel's publicly published them. It's certainly not humiliating for Hamas for him to be fighting to the end. Of course, there were also allegedly 2 grenades thrown at Israeli soldiers previous to this drone getting this footage. So he was very much fighting in combat right to the end of his life. The idea that it's somehow a coup or a victory for Hamas is, it's silly. I think, we're in a really extraordinary situation where we've seen tens of thousands of people being killed, maybe 100,000 plus. We've seen thousands of people being killed in Lebanon. We've seen Hezbollah have massive hits to their infrastructure with regards to their leadership, with regards to personnel, because of course there were those rigged mics and radios with explosives a few weeks ago, which took out hundreds of their personnel at least. These are major setbacks for the Palestinian National Liberation Movement, which, by the way, Hamas is a part of. I said this on Twitter and people kind of flipped out, but they're terrorists or whatever. They do X, Y, Z. They're horrible. Literally, that's irrelevant. National liberation movements have, across history, encompassed people who just do civil resistance, just do law-abiding, non-violent direct action, terrorism, workers' movements, the whole lot. And you can talk about India under the British. You can talk about Palestine today. You can talk about every single national liberation movement. There has always been a diversity of tactics. There's always been a wide range of organizational types and ideologies at play. Often they're attacking each other too, by the way. So yes, this is a setback. clearly a series of setbacks for the Palestinian National Liberation Movement. Clearly, I also want to talk about that bizarre, euphoric conclusion or set of conclusions being made by Benjamin Netanyahu, and about how this is really set back Iran. Palestinian National Liberation, which, by the way, yes, like I say, these movements have included terrorists, what would be called sort of protest repertoires in the past. That has existed since the 1940s. In fact, you could say it goes all the way back to 1923, when you get the first instances of violence by Zionist settlers against Palestinians in Palestine. At that time, the Mandate of Palestine held by the British, overseen by the British. So that's 100 years old, that kind of violence, and also, of course, that kind of counter-violence, people defending themselves and whatnot. And, of course, the Iranian Revolution only happens in 1979. Hezbollah, Michael, I think doesn't exist until the 80s. There is, prior to that, a Shia Lebanese organization called Amal. It still exists, but that was the main group in town for Lebanese Shia prior to Hezbollah. Hamas, quite recent. The PLO, of course, used to be big shots. I think they were founded. You tell me. You know this stuff pretty well. I think after maybe 63 or 67. They kind of get absolutely hammered in 80, 82 in South Lebanon. They have to move their base to Tunis. They basically become politically irrelevant. They're revived with the Oslo Accords. They then transmute into what's called the Palestinian Authority. You have Fatah. So you have organized, which basically means Palestinian National Liberation Movement acronym in Arabic. So you have all kinds of organizations over 100 years. And at various times, they've had their leaderships taken out, people murdered, people assassinated. And still, Michael, we are still in a place where you have mass action, peaceful and non-peaceful, by Palestinians against occupying forces. Still. So the idea that, oh, well, we've got these Iranian proxies, it's all over. Like I say, the Iranian Revolution was in 1979. This stuff was happening for a very long time before the Iranian Revolution, even if they got rid of the regime in Tehran. And I use the word regime as a political scientist. It's not loaded as some moral term. If they changed the government in Tehran through a coup, through a regime change style intervention, there would still be this kind of action. Because, as you've said, there are millions of Palestinians, both in the West Bank and in Gaza, but also in its near abroad, in Jordan, in Lebanon, who want a national homeland. They want the right to self-determination. And that's not going to change. And I did pose this question on Twitter earlier on. There is not really an example of a national liberation movement being destroyed through killing a leadership. It doesn't happen. I mean, very rarely, actually, can you defeat national liberation movements at all. So far, I think the outstanding example of the last 100, 150 years is the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka. But that wasn't done by the Sri Lankan government through taking out 5 or 10 leaders or constantly shooting, leadership cadre over 50, 60, 70 years. That was a war, a full-on war like what we're seeing in Gaza over a very long period of time. And it was utter decimation of their opponents. And I think that's basically the game that Netanyahu is now looking to play. They want to basically do to Palestinian resistance what happened to the Tamil Tigers. But even then, I think it's different because you have so many Palestinians in the diaspora. You will still have so many people sympathetic to their cause. I just think it's qualitatively different. So I think it shows a real political illiteracy on the behalf of people watching, thinking, well, he killed this one person, therefore this national liberation movement is over. That's not how these kinds of political movements work. Doesn't mean they always succeed. There's many failed national liberation movements, Kurds, for instance. But the idea that you can just take out 1, 2 people, or even one organization, my goodness, no. There is a lesson from the last 100 years that is most certainly not the case.
In our introduction, we forgot one world leader. And when we were going through the people responding to Sinwar's death, and of course the man everyone has been waiting to hear from was our very own Keir Starmer.
No one should mourn the death of Hamas leader Sinwar. On his hands is the blood of innocent Israelis killed on the 7th of October and over years of terror. And also the blood of the Palestinian people who suffered in the chaos and violence that he sought and celebrated. We continue to support Israel's right to self-defense, particularly in the face of the attacks by the Iranian regime. Allies will keep working together to de-escalate across the region, because we know there is no military-only solution here. The answer is diplomacy. And now we must make the most of this moment. What is needed now is a ceasefire in Gaza, the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, immediate access for humanitarian aid, and a return to the path towards the two-state solution as the only way to deliver long-term peace and security.
A number of things to say there. I mean, one of the things I find so frustrating is whenever the Labour Party or Keir Starmer has said, can you put some pressure on Israel? Can you put some pressure on America? They say, oh, they're never going to listen to us. And now he's basically lecturing the Palestinian people. You shouldn't mourn Sinwar. You shouldn't mourn him. He's to blame for what's happened to you since October the 7th. Why the hell would they listen to you, Keir Starmer? If you're going to say, look, I mean, we don't really speak out of turn. You know, I prefer to talk about what's going on here. If that's what you say when it comes to Israel, to the United States, to Biden, then maybe be a little bit consistent. Also, I think really, really telling. So he had 3 demands at the end there. He had release of the hostages, a ceasefire, and the entry of humanitarian aid. Now, there was only one of those 3 where he used the word unconditional. So the ceasefire didn't need to be unconditional. Letting in aid didn't need to be unconditional. Release of the hostages did need to be unconditional, right? So he's giving very different standards for the different ones, because obviously that's exactly, Netanyahu could agree with any of that, right? Well, if there's an unconditional release of the hostages, Netanyahu says he wants a ceasefire, but he wants a ceasefire with his conditions. So calling for a ceasefire without specifying that Netanyahu can't say, well, yeah, of course I want a ceasefire, but only if I can make sure that Hamas can never, ever, ever in the future attack Israel. And by the way, I also want really no Palestinians living in half of Gaza, right? If that's what he's going to say, and you say, oh yeah, okay, he's a reasonable guy, he wants a ceasefire. No, you have to say, what are the conditions? But when it comes to releasing the hostages, when it comes to aid, that's allowed to be conditional. Of course, while Starmer gives Israel the benefit of the doubt, the police in this country are continuing a clampdown on Israel's critics. The website Electronic Intifada has revealed that one of their principal journalists has had his home raided. Asa Winstanley is associate editor at Electronic Intifada, and the outlet says that counter-terrorism police raided his house on Thursday and seized several electronic devices. And they report this. A letter addressed to Winstanley from the counter-terrorism command of the Metropolitan Police Service indicates that the authorities are aware of your profession as a journalist, but that notwithstanding, police are investigating possible offences under Sections 1 and 2 of the Terrorism Act. These provisions set out the purported offence of encouragement of terrorism. An officer conducting Thursday's raid informed Winstanley that the investigation was connected with the journalist's social media posts. Attempts to reach the Metropolitan Police Service for comment for this story have been unsuccessful. Electronic Intifada say Winstanley was not arrested. I mean, he hasn't been charged with any offence, but I suppose when you take someone's electronic devices, you're saying we're going to look through all of this and maybe we'll charge you in the future. I assume that's the situation. Aaron, I suppose arresting a journalist, saying that he's promoting terrorism. I mean, I think this is really why it's a bit ridiculous to have movements which are in a different country, which kind of have nothing to do with the UK. I don't think Hamas has ever threatened, or Hamas definitely has never threatened Britain, neither has Hezbollah, right? So it seems odd to me that our law determines the opinions you can have about different sides in international conflicts. Right, because obviously you can say what the hell you like about the IDF. You know, there are loads of people defending what the IDF are doing in Gaza. They don't have to worry about sort of the police knocking on their door. But if you say Palestinians have an unconditional right to self-defense by any means necessary, which is, by the way, something I don't, agree with. I think they have a right to self-defense within the limits of international law. Now, not everyone agrees with that, right? But there is only one side here where the police might knock on your door. And that's if you're siding with the people who, or if you're more sympathetic, the people who aren't UK allies. It does seem to me that the Terrorism Act is an infringement on really important political free speech.
Oh, 100%. This is clearly about, I say clearly, it seems very likely because, of course, you're mentioning their social media posts. about the potential endorsement or support of quote-unquote prescribed organizations. So Hezbollah, Hamas. Even though Tony Blair and Mike Gates spoke to Hamas in the early 2000s, now the Home Secretary has determined that they're a prescribed organization. You can't even tweet about them, right? And I find this law very strange. Look, I'm not supporting or endorsing any prescribed organizations. Certainly wouldn't do that here on Novara Media. But I do think major questions have to be asked about a law which gives that much power to the Home Secretary. Home Secretary can just flick a switch. This new organization is now prescribed. If you support them, if you're perceived to support them, that's now a criminal offense. Really? Are our civil liberties that flimsy? Is the rule of law in this country such a joke? Really? People talk about freedom of speech, but the Home Secretary can make that decision, and then all of a sudden that's it. You know, they're trying to do the same thing now with the Revolutionary Guard of Iran, the IRGC, prescribed organization. How can you prescribe as a terrorist organization part of a military of a sovereign nation state? Terrorist organizations, historically, in the literature, have been non-state actors. I mean, it's obscene. It's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. If you're starting to prescribe nation states' militaries as prescribed organizations, I mean, it defies belief. So if there's a war, if somebody invades Iran and then the IRGC does something and you say that's a really impressive military maneuver or whatever, or there's, aid domestically they're delivering to part of their population because of an earthquake or whatever. I'm offering the stupidest possible examples because this is the law, right? And would they execute this by the letter of the law? That would be support and endorsement for a prescribed terrorist organization. Hezbollah, they oversee loads of social services in Lebanon, from healthcare to basic social services, state infrastructure, what should be state infrastructure. If you say that in many of those instances they're doing a good job, that's really impressive. Wow, for a social movement organization to be overseeing these kinds of competencies that historically we associate with the state, wow, that's endorsement of a terrorist organization. So I find it very odd. And look, I think clearly you do need to prescribe the endorsement of certain terrorist organizations, like you say, if they're operating in the UK. Look, if there was a far-right, if there was a neo-Nazi organization, Michael, and they were trying to assassinate politicians and they were blowing up explosives, like in Italy in the 1970s with the Piazza Fontana bombing. There's a bombing in Trafalgar Square and 70 people are killed and they're going around assassinating politicians. Yes, of course, support and endorsement for that kind of action, I think, should be criminal. Yes, of course. But like you say, these are organizations, the other side of the planet. Why on earth should one opinion, whichever way it is, by the way, be prescribed under law? It's insane, I think. I mean, I've always said we need a codified right to freedom of speech in this country. You can't do that in the US. It's a very, very different set of rules. Dahlia made a really good point actually on the Tuesday show, where employees here under the Equality Act have far more protections than employees do in the US when it comes to freedom of conscience, like David Miller, for instance. We now know that anti-Zionist political views are protected under law. They are a protected characteristic fundamentally. That doesn't exist in the US. However, in the US, they have something we don't have, which is constitutional right to free speech. And you can say things like, I support X, right? Not that I would do that. Not that I'm saying that's wise or whatever, but that's the point of free speech, isn't it? And you might disagree or agree on that instance, but not in that instance. So the law itself, I think, is very strange. And I think the fact that they can intimidate journalists on the basis of this is not good, frankly. And I'll say one final thing as well, Michael, because we saw that clip from Keir Starmer a few moments before you mentioned the Asa Winstanley story. The man is just an imbecile. He's an imbecile. I think he presumes to know a lot more about this conflict than he actually does. The idea that Britain will give unalloyed support to Israel from these Iranian attacks, ergo, this is the only reading I can make from it. Ergo, Britain supports Israel's extrajudicial killing of people at Haniya in Iran. They support the killing of diplomatic Iranian staff in Syria. They support the shooting of civilian scientists on the streets of Tehran. They support illegal settlements in the West Bank. And of course, I said, "No, we don't support that. It's illegal under international law. We're going to sanction 3 schools and an NGO." Whoop-de-doo. You're giving material, financial, in the case of the United States, and in the case of the UK, political and military support to the country doing this. Okay, so you can't whinge about it and whine about it. We're a key cog in this, and I really do think Brits need to look at the conduct of our Prime Minister and say, yes, we do have blood on our hands, because this is the person who's been democratically elected to be our Prime Minister, and he's saying the most revolting things. He doesn't have to say anything. Okay, you might say, well, look, he's the Prime Minister of the UK. Ultimately, we're tied to Washington. He can't have the same position that Norway or Spain has, or whatever. I mean, that's obviously not my view, but okay. But the passion with which he speaks in defense of the Israeli state is really something. I think he really believes this. While we see breach after breach after breach of international law. This man said he was an international lawyer. I presume people hear that and they think, well, he must have been one of the good guys. Maybe he was defending war criminals. I don't know. Otherwise, why does he have such a passion for defending the side which continually breaches international law?
This week, legislation to legalise assisted dying was introduced into the UK Parliament. The details of the legislation are yet to be ironed out, but it's understood it would allow terminally ill adults with 6 months or more to live to get medical help to end their own lives. The bill is being proposed by Kim Leadbeater, who is a Labour backbencher, but the government have promised to allow a free vote on the bill, meaning it has a good chance of becoming law. Kim Leadbeater explained on LBC why and what she's proposing.
These are people who are dying. So it's not about ending their life, it's about shortening their death. And then what we have to do is look at that individual person's ability to sign up for this process. They have to have mental capacity, they have to be mentally competent. And then the proposal that I'm suggesting is there will be 2 doctors involved in this process and then a High Court judge as well. So there are layers and layers of safeguards and protections. There would be a cooling off period so people can change their mind at any time. And there's also evidence in countries where this is an option. People even who sign up for it often don't use this, but the comfort that it provides to them, knowing that it is a choice, enables them to get the very best of whatever time they have left. So it's a really broad discussion, and that's the discussion I want to facilitate.
Helping someone to die is currently a crime in England, Wales and Northern Ireland with a maximum prison sentence of 14 years. That means that the loved ones of people who are terminally ill and want to die face a horrible choice: watch them suffer or risk a criminal conviction. And in extreme cases, the law can lead to incredibly traumatic deaths. Newsnight spoke to someone this week who believes both she and her husband would have benefited from the legalisation of assisted dying. Jane Vervoot's husband suffered from Huntington's disease. That's a genetic disease which causes nerve cells in the brain to decay over time, affecting a person's movements, thinking ability, and mental health. She explained to Newsnight the incredibly distressing circumstances of her husband's death.
We'd kind of reached the very top, and we were downhill now. And it was all about quality of life, not quantity of life.
And in fact, Dirk tried to take his own life
twice.
Yes.
Well, 3 times, but twice the year before.
And it didn't happen.
No.
And in his final hours, you realised his chest was hurting. An ambulance was called. And there was a conversation where he said, actually, I want to die at home. And they
the respect form.
They knew that he had a respect form,
yeah,
which explains that you don't want to be pegged or
antibiotics,
in the stomach, antibiotics revived or anything. And you settled him and he was calm then, wasn't
he? Yeah, he was peaceful. We got him into bed. We were having our last hours with him. We were actually told he wouldn't make it through to the morning, and he still did.
But 4 or 5 hours after that, another ambulance came.
Yeah.
And a number of police officers.
Yeah.
What happened?
They had obviously, somewhere along the line, I had been accused of assisting his suicide. So safeguarding was called, and I was, most of the time I was with Dirk. So a lot of this was going off outside, but I could hear assisted suicide. Dirk was then given a Narcan injection on his deathbed.
And just to explain what that is.
So the Narcan injection reverses, so somebody who's got a drug overdose, so that reverses the effects of the, if there was any, foul play.
You watch this? We watched this injection being administered? So
it would be like something out of a horror film. He tried to get out of bed. We had to sit on him. He was screaming at the police. He was screaming at the paramedics to get out the room. He was in a lot of pain because I was sitting on him. He was in massive amounts of pain. He was in massive amounts of distress. No, it was all very surreal. Nobody could quite work out what was happening at the time. We managed to get him settled quite quickly, to be quite honest.
And they eventually left?
They left.
And the next morning, a police van arrived, and you say 2 police cars. Why?
Well, another phone call had been made, so we're not quite sure why. The same thing as the day before. I mean, the police had left my house previously the day before. There was nothing. Everything was fine. And the whole house just filled up with police, paramedics, and I went to call the GP. He came straight away, and as he assessed Dirk, he just stopped breathing.
Really?
While they were all there watching, which meant all I can remember is the paramedic's face as he died. Nobody quite knew why they should have been in the room with him. He died with no dignity at all.
Such a distressing story. And it actually got worse because after the death of her husband, the lady who was speaking there was given 20 minutes with her, husband who'd just died before being taken in for questioning by the police. Right? They ultimately decided they had no concerns that any crime had been committed. But you can see how this was an incredibly distressing situation, which was made so much worse by the suspicion of the state that she might be assisting in her husband's suicide, which is why, when he was dying, one day a bunch of police and the ambulance come and various sort of law enforcement agencies, and then it happens again the following day. She's saying that should have been a sort of peaceful moment with her husband to say goodbye, and then 2 days in a row, you've got her house filling up with people in law enforcement to say, have you helped in the suicide of your husband? Right? Really, really horrible. And there is an alternative. So Sky News this week spoke to someone whose husband had a positive experience using assisted dying services in Switzerland.
Anne assisted her husband's death. Jeff had motor neurone disease and was paralyzed from the neck down. He faced an agonizing death.
Everything had to be done for him, literally. He couldn't hold a glass, he had to be fed, toileted, everything.
They travelled to Switzerland together to a clinic where he died surrounded by close family and friends.
It hit me when he took the medication, but he died in my arms, telling me he loved me. He said, I love you so, and that was it. It was the most peaceful end, and I have met so many friends whose loved ones have died in distressing circumstances, but I don't have these horrible memories because I lost a dearly loved man who died telling me he loved me.
I mean, that story, from listening to those two stories, you think, wow, right, this is a bit of a slam dunk, right? You don't want people who are fearing the police when they've got a loved one who is dying or wants to die. And of course, people who are terminally ill should have the right to die in the way they choose, right? So it's about the right to choose. And those who support this change in the law say that that's exactly what they're fighting for, and that they should not risk being criminalised in such a situation. However, and this is really important to say, there are also very strong arguments against legalising assisted dying. The main argument here is the danger that it sets in motion a slippery slope. Canada is often referenced here. They initially legalised assisted dying only for the terminally ill, but in 2021 expanded the right to people with non-terminal health conditions. And there are concerns that people are being approved for assisted suicide as an alternative to poverty. This news report from October 2022 is thoroughly dystopian.
Are you afraid to die?
Who isn't? Yeah,
Amir Farsood has applied for medically assisted dying, known as MAID. He lives in constant agony due to a back injury, but has started the process for end of life because his rooming house is up for sale and he can't find anywhere else to live that he can afford. He barely survives on Ontario disability support payments, which are just over $1,200 a month. He doesn't want to die, but being homeless is not an option.
I know in my present health condition, I wouldn't survive it anyway.
Farsood meets the criteria for MAID, physical suffering due to disability that cannot be relieved. His doctor, who knows Farsood's real reason for MAID is his fear of being homeless, signed off on the application in August. Farsood needs a second to do the same. There's a 90-day waiting period. He believes he could potentially access MAID in about a month.
I don't wish to be dead, even with the pain, even with the meds. I still want to be here.
There's obviously such a shocking clip. And as a sort of update, that particular case had I don't know whether to call it a happy ending because it's all really strange, right? Following the broadcasting of that report, a woman in Toronto, set up a crowdfunder for the man in that clip. It raised enough for him to pay off his debts and pay his rent. And so he didn't go ahead with the state-assisted suicide. I say that I'm not sure whether to call that a happy ending because it's not a situation I think anyone would be comfortable with. He was going to get the state to help him kill himself, and then a crowdfunder was set up, so he didn't. I mean, that's not the future I want. Not that, but again, I said this is very complicated, this issue. In the UK, disability rights activists have been some of the most vocal opponents of the legalisation of assisted dying, and they include the actress Liz Carr. Liz is best known for portraying the role of Clarissa Mullery in the BBC crime drama Silent Witness, and she recently fronted the BBC documentary Better Off Dead with a question mark. I spoke to Liz earlier today to discuss why she is so opposed to assisted dying.
I fundamentally believe that to change the law, to allow the state to have an involvement in certain groups of people's deaths, that is through the medical profession, who would essentially be allowed, indemnified to take certain lives. That feels like a scary thing when you're potentially in the category that could be assisted to die. And my concern, amongst many others, is that protecting an individual right or giving certain groups of people this so-called choice or right has huge consequences for many other people. And that for me, the purpose of a law is to safeguard its citizens in general. And I think there will be considerable numbers of disabled, ill, older, marginalised groups of people. This is a massive class issue as well, who may feel the pressure, could be abused, coerced into feeling that this is a solution, that when other solutions aren't provided for social ills, that this becomes the easy, the cheap, the quick for the disposable already. So, yeah, I have lots of concerns, but that's probably number one.
From the other side, so having watched your BBC documentary, which I thought was excellent, by the way, it was very, very convincing that sort of extending these to people who aren't terminally ill is really, really dangerous, because you end up with people getting pressured to take their own lives if they see themselves as a burden, or if they think that society or people around them see themselves as a burden. It seems like it's a very, very dangerous route to go down. But lots of people will have, seen testimony of people whose, the death of their partners was so difficult because assisted dying was illegalized. And also you end up with people who end up sort of under suspicion or going through the criminal justice process because they personally have taken a decision which, many people watching think was a reasonable one, to help their loved one go in a dignified way. So do you not think there is room for a law whereby the kind of thing you're concerned about is absolutely still illegal, but people who do go through the awful experience of having a loved one who's terminally ill, who wants to go sooner than sort of the natural course would have it, for that to be legal as well? Can we not have space for both of these?
I think we can, and we do. I think that's the thing. I think in our imperfect system, I think we have it in the right place. That doesn't mean it's working well. And I think there are changes that can happen. But something that feels really important to me is that currently the prohibition on assisted suicide rests in the criminal law. And that is really, really important, because when it moves over to being a medical treatment, then assisted suicide ends up in the hands of doctors. And we kind of know that it's almost impossible to prove, it's such a closed shop, that there were issues, that there were problems, that there was malpractice. So you'll often hear people talk about Oregon, which has a relatively tight law. Oregon in the US, it's one of the 11 states in America where it is legal, and it's often touted. Kim Leadbeater is saying it's like the Oregon law. Absolutely, maybe it is in some ways. But what happens is one of the two doctors who assesses you is then the doctor that gives you the drugs, and is then the doctor that does the oversight. And the requirement for oversight is more minimal than any other medical procedure. So the way it currently works, where it can feel unfair, is that we hear that anybody assisting and supporting somebody to end their life could be at risk of prosecution. Here's a thing that you're not hearing generally in the news. Not one person has been prosecuted for assisting anyone to go to Switzerland. Not one person. There have been relatively small numbers of prosecutions under that law, but not for this purpose. So it's quite disingenuous that after guidelines incidentally brought in by the current Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, when he was DPP, Director of Public Prosecutions, he brought in guidelines that helped the current law make sense, so that it would still have the the effect that it would put you off. It has a preventative criminal aspect to it, but there was also a discretionary aspect that allowed sentencing, well, actually way before that, in how it was treated, to be looked at compassionately and fairly. So if somebody made it very, very clear that they were going abroad to do this thing, then, and everything looked above board, then of course nothing would happen. Nothing has happened. That keeps the law where it is now. And also, the problem here is we're hearing about suffering, we're hearing about pain at the end of the life, but there's an awful lot of that, and people aren't wanting to go to Dignitas, if that makes sense. People aren't wanting to end their lives. But this suffering and pain is in part caused by the fact that end-of-life care provision, hospice provision, even NHS provision before we get to that point, is so poor and underfunded at the moment that, again, we are not doing everything that we can to ensure that that is where it needs to be. So we don't know how many people are going to Dignitas because actually they've not had the right support. And you can argue, well, it really doesn't matter why they're going, if that's where they want to go or where they want to, have an end to their life. But it does matter, because if there is a solution that we can do something about, then shouldn't we be looking at that first before this? Let's remember what this is. This is the state and the NHS having a hand in certain groups of people's deaths. Now, that can sound, come on, the way you're putting it. It would be consensual. Nobody's going to be carted away in the euthanasia vans. No, not at all. The person has to go through certain, they're called safeguards. I'd call them criteria. They're very, very minimal. You have to say that you want to end your life that way. You have to get 2 doctors to approve. But if we're looking at the Oregon model, for example, if your doctor doesn't support you, and quite often GPs that know the person will not support someone to go ahead with this, then you simply go to a doctor that does support it and is very pro and supportive of assisted suicide. I'm not sure that's a safeguard. That's just a way to make it happen. The other thing is, I guess, it feels like this individual, this choice, like I'm going to be called, I have been. I made the mistake the other day of reading below the line. There was an article and I had said something about this subject, and I looked at the comments, and I'm denying people their choice. And it's interesting because I would consider myself pro-choice. The only difference between me and many disabled activists who were together campaigning against this is that we believe in choice, but not the choice, this particular one, not the choice to have medical professions assist some people to die. And I guess we feel it so personally, because honestly, you mentioned earlier the situation, the person's situation on Newsnight. That person wasn't terminally ill, they were disabled. And so far in all the media, pretty much, other than Esther Ranson, who's terminally ill, most of the other situations you're seeing, those people are not terminally ill. So when I'm asked why I absolutely believe there will be a slippery slope, I say I don't believe there's a slippery slope. I believe it's an inevitability. Because if you introduce a law for one group of people, a right, you have a right to this, then inevitably you have to extend it to other groups that want that. Otherwise, it's discrimination. So ironically, in the name of equality, you would need to extend assisted suicide for terminally ill people to those who aren't terminally ill but have a medical condition. It's exactly what happened in Canada. It's what's happened in many of the other countries where it's legal. And that's why I know that this is about me and other disabled people. And I know that because I think visually, honestly, I think if somebody that looks frail and like they've been ill in their life, and I have, appears on TV and said that I wanted to die, I tell you, I know that people would far more understand it than try to prevent it. And I've seen that across the board, that this discussion is often sullied and blurred because the people that are wheeled out and present their desire to die aren't actually terminally ill. They are disabled. And what that tells me is that we're culturally already shifting and blurring the line before a law has even got in. And, you know, what I know so far is that with the bill that is going to be voted on at the end of November, we know that there's a cohort of cross-party MPs looking to already extend Kim Leadbeater's bill to people who are suffering intolerably. That is, people with a medical condition of some type who say that their experience is so poor that they are suffering and they shouldn't be denied access to medically assisted suicide. We know that two of the big campaigning groups for assisted suicide are already pushing for it to be extended. They're not happy with the bill that Kim will be putting forward. And we also know that half of the people from the UK that currently go to Dignitas, half of them wouldn't qualify under Kim Leadbeater's bill. So the unfairness with the law, the pushing, the having to find the funds, the worrying about the prosecution, which is unfounded, as I said, that's going to continue even if Kim Leadbeater's bill goes through. It's an inevitability. It will be extended. Then it will become absolutely about disability. And then it will be used because people's support systems are currently so poor in this country for many people. It will be used for socioeconomic reasons. I have absolutely no doubt. And I haven't got a crystal ball, but years ago, many of us said, this is about disability and disabled people, and this will be used for economic, social problems. The solution will be seen as assisted suicide, and that is happening now. We're seeing that in Canada. Why wouldn't it happen here?
Novara Media's Ash Sarkar was on BBC Question Time this week. Let's see how it went.
40,000 people in Gaza are dead at least. That's probably an undercount. At least 16,000 children. This week, an independent UN report singled out the destruction of healthcare services in particular and said that Israel could be guilty of the crime of extermination. Israel is facing accusations of genocide at the International Court of Justice. The International Criminal Court also found that Israel had been upholding apartheid and occupation predominantly in the West Bank. This was not about self-defense. It was about using the horrific events of October 7th as an excuse to ethnically cleanse parts of Gaza, to destroy much of the Palestinian population in Gaza, and to redraw the regional map so that Israel comes out on top.
I mean, really important there. Issues we talk about so much on this show. Let's go to a next intervention. Ash was asked about a hypothetical. What would Israeli self-defense have looked like if they hadn't done what they did?
You have to look at what is most in the interests of civilians, both Palestinian and Israeli. The only way forward would be a negotiated settlement. There was ceasefire for hostages deals on the table as far back as last October. And part of the reason why Netanyahu kept rejecting it is because he thought he could push his part further. And
So
that has endangered Israeli civilians. They've been subject to rocket attacks. It's endangered the lives of those hostages who are still in Gaza.
So
What do you think in utter savagery?
What do you think
in Gaza.
Israel should have done on the 8th of October?
I think what they should have done is negotiated for those hostages back and also put
negotiate
a peace
with
process.
Hamas?
Yes, and put a
On the
peace
day
process.
after the attack?
Yes, and I'll tell you why. I can hear you laughing in the background. Nothing that the Palestinians have done has resulted in the advancement of their cause. When they've chosen peaceful means, like the Great March of Return a couple of years ago, Israeli forces opened fire and killed over 200 people.
Okay.
It's kind of odd the way this. You would negotiate with them the day after October the 7th. I mean, in a hostage situation, you do normally negotiate with the hostage takers kind of straight away. Like the response to a hostage situation isn't normally let's bomb a bunch of cities and kill tens of thousands of civilians. The response that Israel has had to a hostage situation is not normal. We don't want to start seeing that as the precedent which one would expect in such a situation, and treat any other proposal as sort of borderline ridiculous. I don't think that would be a particularly helpful or healthy place for us to get to as a society. Also on the panel was conservative author and satirist Konstantin Kissin. Here's how he responded to Ash's points.
The idea that in the wake of the largest terrorist attack in living memory in Israel and around the world, the solution to that was to negotiate with the people who not only did it, not only murdered over 1,000 people and raped women and took hundreds of hostages and dragged them off, but also have continued to commit themselves to repeating that attack again and again and again. The idea that you could possibly negotiate with these people when they continue to promise to repeat their terrorist attack. The man who was killed today was appointed to replace the man who was assassinated, who was the previous leader of Hamas, in order to demonstrate the commitment to this. Jeremy Bowen of the BBC just a few days ago interviewed one of the leaders of Hamas who refused to commit to his two-state solution, who refused to abandon the cause of terrorism. My point to you is there's an option on the table for Hamas, which is to hand back the hostages they've taken, to withdraw the threat that they have given repeatedly through their various leaders, to repeat the terrorist attack of October 7th, to hand over the terrorists who committed those atrocities for justice. And then Israel, of course, must immediately stop hostilities and negotiate for peace.
There is an option that they can immediately do, right? There's an option that Israel could immediately do as well, which is withdraw all of its settlements from the West Bank, which is to say the Palestinians can have a state, which is to end apartheid, right? Both sides could do something which would immediately end the conflict, but neither sides are willing to because, well, I suppose on the Israeli case, they don't need to because they're so strong. And on the Palestinian side, it's because their minimum demands haven't been met. None of them they can live with. Aaron, what did you make of that sort of conversation? It's always a difficult question to get asked, what should they have done on October the 8th? Because it ignores the fact that, well, what Israel probably should have done is not illegally occupy the West Bank and Gaza for 56 years.
Well, that's quite right. I mean, the context here is all important. If you're going to decry terrorism, then talk about the King David Hotel bombing by the Irgun and Zionist militias, which killed, I think, 90 plus people. Talk about the fact that hundreds of British personnel were killed in the Mandate of Palestine, all the way up to the Declaration of Independence by Israel. Talk about the fact, Michael, this is really extraordinary, the sergeant's affair. There were two sergeants, two British sergeants. They weren't just killed and hanged by Zionist militias. Their bodies were booby-trapped so that when they would be cut down by their comrades, they would also be harmed. Indeed, one of those men was. This was celebrated by somebody who would go on to become, Menachem Begin, who would go on to become the president of Israel, or the prime minister of Israel, effectively one of the most senior political figures in Israel. And yet, people who say these are wonderful political figures, this is a country whose morals are spick and span, beyond reproach. Apparently, Hamas and Hezbollah are abysmal. You can never work with them. You can never negotiate with them. What do you think the origins of Israel are? What do you think the Irgun was? What do you think the Stern Gang was? What do you think Lehi was? These were all terrorist militias. They killed people, and they got what they wanted. By the way, when those two sergeants were killed and hanged, and like I say, one of their bodies was booby-trapped, once that happened, the Brits, in particular Ernest Bevin, who I think at the time was the Foreign Secretary, said, we have to get out of here. These people are nuts. We are not capable of engaging with this. There is not, quote unquote, a political solution here because the violence is just so utterly extraordinary. We can't deal with it. So I find it strange that that is what is inflicted on the Palestinian people. And yet, when they adopt the same tactics, by the way, I agree with you, Michael. I think breaking international law is bad, right? I think attacks on civilians is bad. Unarmed civilians is bad. So what's good for the goose is good for the gander? Or no, only one side can do it. You know, I raised this with Konstantin, and he said, well, there was an agreement offered, I think in 46 under the UN. The Palestinians didn't take it. They should have taken it. There's a lesson there. Well, if I said to Konstantin, why aren't you saying the same thing for Ukraine? There's a deal there from Russia. They'll just have the Donbass and Crimea. Why won't Ukraine take it? And if Ukraine won't take it, silly Ukraine. Well, Russia broke international law. Russia invaded the Donbass, right? So he's going to accept that in one instance, but not the other. And of course, that's because, I think for people like Konstantin, he views support for Palestine, criticism of Israel, he views that as quote-unquote left-coded. He doesn't like the left, therefore he must disagree with that position. And he's come to that conclusion, by the way, like many people, I think, without actually engaging with the history, without engaging with the genealogy of ideas, activism, action that leads to the creation of the State of Israel in the mid-1940s. He is not familiar necessarily with the fact that actually civil rights activism by Palestinians over decades has been destroyed. They should do the peaceful civil rights thing. They do. They did. They got shot. They got assassinated. So the whole conversation is utterly nonsensical in this country, partly because, Michael, we have an institutionally stupid media. Now, there is often very good reporting, but when you actually broadly try and find an in-depth, detailed, intelligent account of what has happened in this country, or this land, I should say, over the last 100 years, it's almost impossible to find. And people think, well, this is a thousands-year-old religious feud. No, it's not. Jews and Muslims and, practicing Jews and Arabs lived in this part of the world quite peacefully, actually, in places like Jaffa, for a pretty long time before the foundation of the State of Israel. It's not thousands of years old. It's actually an outgrowth. It's a direct outgrowth of contemporary 19th century nationalism, of which Zionism is a manifestation. So that the basis of that debate, Michael, I think really rests upon a profoundly ignorant public discourse when it comes to Israel-Palestine. So talking about the details of he said, she said, do you agree with this particular point or that particular point? I think it's a hiding to nothing, because the basis, the foundation for these kinds of discussions are so idiotic that, of course, they don't make sense. So I think the left, or people that care about, not even the left, I mean, the fact that it is left-coded is a problem. You want the right, you want conservatives to think, actually, this is awful. We need a sensible solution here that preserves human rights and the right to national self-determination. I think we should be resisting this impulse to say he's right on this point or she's wrong on this point. Ash made a great response to Konstantin, by the way, when she said that Israel doesn't recognize a two-state solution. Israel, in its history, has had zero interest in a two-state solution. The reason why the Oslo Accords are being conducted with the PLO and with Yasser Arafat is because there are other factions in Palestinian civil society offering really concrete plans about how to create a workable Palestinian state. But instead, what serves the Israelis was to circumvent those people. By the way, they didn't even work with the PLO. The PLO didn't have a formal delegation at Oslo. So you've got peace. There was a peace negotiations. The PLO weren't allowed to be there. The PLO had to work via, I believe, the Jordanian representatives. it's just a nonsense. Israel is not serious about a two-state solution. It never has been. It wants as much land as possible with as few Palestinians on it as possible. And that Greater Israel point, for many, meant that they wanted the West Bank and Gaza. But of course, it could also expand. You know, there have been Israeli settlers in the Sinai. They were removed in the 80s after a peace agreement between Israel and Egypt. But at one point, that also was a part of a Greater Israel. So, like I said, I'll just finish on this point, Michael. The idea that the left support Palestine, therefore I'm right wing, I must support Israel, is so dumb. Read some books on this stuff. Why not start with watching my video, my interview with Ilan Pappé about the rise of the Zionist lobby? Read his books about the Nakba. Read his books about how this conflict has played out over 100 years. It's not that simple.
It's interesting, that Russia point, isn't it? Because I sometimes find it also goes the other way, where people are sort of saying, Ukraine, they should have signed the deal. And then when it comes to Palestine, they say, of course they shouldn't sign any deal. They need to be free from the river to the sea. I do think the inconsistencies go both ways, although I'm not accusing you of that, Aaron, nor Ash. Let's wrap up there. Thank you, Aaron, for joining me this evening. Although, before we finish, can you tell us a bit about this Sunday's Downstream? Yeah,
I think it's with Dave Goldson, who's a big insect guy. Michael, he's an entomologist. We had a great conversation about pollinators. I know it sounds strange. You know, I did an interview this week with a historian and a political economist. We're talking about Israel-Palestine. Insects really matter. I think 3/4 of crops need insect pollinators. Without insects, the world as we know it is over. It's hugely important. If you care about the climate crisis, if you care about biodiversity, tune in. This Sunday on Novara Media, I'm talking to Dave Goldson about why we need to save the bees.
Save the bees. Thank you, everyone, for watching tonight. Come back on Monday for another show from 6 p.m. Although, of course, come back on Sunday, actually, for 3 p.m. to learn all about bees. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.